in Iran are great people, and all of the people I know, so many in New York, these are great people.
Have you ever wondered how a single policy decision can ripple through the world, destabilizing economies, toppling governments, and affecting the lives of millions? Picture this. A powerful nation flexes its muscles, not with tanks or missiles, but with financial restrictions and trade bans. This is the hidden battleground of economic sanctions, a realm where the stakes are high, the strategies complex, and the outcomes uncertain. Do these economic weapons really bring about change, or are they just a facade, masking deeper political agendas? Let's dive deep into the complex world of economic sanctions and uncover their true power and pitfalls. Sanctions have been around for centuries. Even in ancient times, they were used as a tool of political and economic pressure. One of the earliest examples comes from the city of Athens in ancient Greece. Athens imposed economic sanctions on the city of Megara in the 5th century BCE, essentially banning Megarian traders from Athenian markets. This was part of the lead-up to the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that lasted for nearly 3 decades and involved many of the Greek city-states. The sanctions didn't lead to a quick resolution. Instead, they escalated tensions and contributed to a prolonged and devastating war. It's a classic example of how sanctions can sometimes backfire, leading to greater conflict rather than resolution. Fast forward to modern times and we see Iran as a significant target of international sanctions. The United States has imposed numerous sanctions on Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which saw the overthrow of the Shah and the establishment of an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The initial sanctions were a response to the hostage crisis, where 52 American diplomats and citizens were held for 444 days. Over the years, sanctions have been ramped up in response to Iran's nuclear program, human rights violations, and support for militant groups in the region. The sanctions have had a profound impact on Iran's economy. Restrictions on its oil exports, financial transactions, and access to international markets have caused significant economic hardship. Every day, Iranians have felt the brunt of these measures, with rising prices, shortages of essential goods, and high unemployment. Despite this, the Iranian government has shown remarkable resilience, finding ways to circumvent some of the restrictions and even developing domestic alternatives to imported goods. Iran's ability to adapt highlights a common theme with sanctions. They often hurt the general population more than the targeted regime, which can sometimes use the external pressure to actually bolster its domestic support by blaming foreign enemies for the country's problems. Iraq's experience with sanctions provides another stark example. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the United Nations imposed comprehensive sanctions aimed at forcing Saddam Hussein to withdraw. Now, while the military intervention eventually succeeded in liberating Kuwait, the sanctions remained in place for years afterward. These measures devastated Iraq's economy and infrastructure. The healthcare system collapsed, leading to a humanitarian crisis with widespread malnutrition and disease. According to UNICEF, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died as a result of the sanctions. The sanctions also failed to topple Saddam Hussein's regime, but caused immense suffering amongst ordinary Iraqis. The lesson again here is clear. Broad economic sanctions can have severe humanitarian consequences without necessarily achieving their political goals. Russia, of course, has faced significant sanctions, particularly after its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its current involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Western nations, including the United States and the European Union, have imposed sanctions targeting key sectors of the Russian economy, such as finance, energy, and defense. These sanctions were aimed to isolate Russia economically and pressure it to change its policies. However, Russia has shown resilience, partly due to its vast natural resources and its ability to pivot towards non-Western markets, particularly China. Despite the economic strain, the sanctions have not led to significant changes in Russia's foreign policy nor its leadership. This underscores the limitations of sanctions when dealing with a country that has significant internal resources and alternative trading partners. China, despite its economic power, has also been a target of sanctions, primarily due to its human rights record and territorial ambitions. The US and other Western nations have imposed sanctions related to China's actions in Xinjiang, where the government has been accused of widespread human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim population, as well as its crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. While these sanctions have had some impact, China's vast economy and its critical role in global supply chains make it a challenging target. China has continued its policies largely unabated, using its economic leverage to mitigate the effects of sanctions. The case of China illustrates the difficulty of using sanctions to influence a powerful, integrated global economy. Cuba, on the other hand, provides a long-term case study in the effects of sanctions on a smaller economy. The US embargo against Cuba has been more or less in place for over 6 decades, starting during the Cold War in response to the communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. The embargo aimed to isolate Cuba economically and to force political change. Now, while it has severely restricted Cuba's economic development and access to international markets, the Cuban government has nevertheless survived. Over the years, Cuba has adapted by fostering relationships with other nations and developing domestic industries. The embargo has had limited success in achieving its political goals, but has caused significant hardship for the everyday Cuban people. The persistence of the Cuban regime, despite decades of sanctions, highlights the limitations of this approach in bringing about regime change. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, faced extensive international sanctions, particularly in response to its involvement in terrorism and its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. The sanctions, imposed by the United Nations and Western nations, included restrictions on oil exports, financial transactions, and arms sales. These measures isolated Libya economically and diplomatically, leading to significant economic challenges. Despite the pressure, Gaddafi's regime remained in power until the Arab Spring uprisings, which led to international military intervention and his eventual overthrow. The Libyan case demonstrates that while sanctions can weaken a regime, they often need to be part of a broader strategy that includes diplomatic and sometimes military components to be effective. Sanctions are a complex tool with mixed results. While they can exert significant economic pressure and signal international disapproval, they do often fail to achieve their primary political objectives. Moreover, they frequently cause widespread suffering among civilian populations, raising ethical questions about their use. The experiences of countries like Iran, Iraq, Russia, China, Cuba, Libya, and even ancient Athens illustrate the varied outcomes and unintended consequences of sanctions. The use of sanctions often reflects the power dynamics in international relations. Powerful countries, particularly the US, leverage their economic dominance to impose sanctions, while smaller or less powerful nations have limited recourse. This imbalance raises questions about the fairness and effectiveness of sanctions as a tool of international diplomacy. For instance, the US has imposed thousands of sanctions globally, often using its financial system's central role in the world economy to exert influence. This has in turn led to criticism that sanctions are actually a form of economic imperialism used to maintain global dominance rather than to promote genuine international justice. One of the critical challenges with sanctions is ensuring that they are a part of a coherent and comprehensive strategy. Sanctions alone are unlikely to compel significant political change unless they are combined with diplomatic efforts and, in some cases, the credible threat of military action. For example, the sanctions against Iran, which were part of a broader strategy that included diplomatic negotiations, eventually led to the 2015 nuclear agreement. However, the subsequent withdrawal of the US from the agreement and the re-imposition of sanctions have now complicated the situation, demonstrating the challenges of maintaining a consistent and effective sanctions policy. In many cases, sanctions have led to unintended consequences. They can strengthen the resolve of the targeted regime as leaders use the sanctions to rally nationalist sentiment and blame external enemies for economic hardships. This has been evident in countries like Iran and Russia, where the regimes have used sanctions as a propaganda tool to reinforce their hold on power. Additionally, sanctions can push targeted countries to develop self-sufficiency or seek alternative economic partners, reducing their long-term effectiveness. For instance, Russia has increased its economic ties with China and other non-Western countries in direct response to Western sanctions. The humanitarian impact of sanctions is also a significant concern. Comprehensive sanctions often lead to severe economic hardships for the civilian population, including shortages of food, medicine, and other essential goods. This raises significant ethical questions about the use of sanctions and whether in fact they are at all a justifiable tool of international policy. The international community has increasingly recognized the need to design sanctions that minimize humanitarian impacts, such as targeted or smart sanctions that focus on specific individuals or entities rather than the broader economy. The experiences of places like Athens, Iraq, Iran, Russia, China, Cuba, and Libya, amongst many others, highlight the complexities and unintended consequences of sanctions. For sanctions to be effective, they need to be part of a comprehensive strategy that includes diplomatic efforts and, in some cases, the credible threat of military action. Moreover, the design and implementation of sanctions should carefully consider their humanitarian impact to ensure that they do not cause undue suffering to civilian populations. As the international community continues to grapple with these challenges, it is clear that sanctions, while an important tool, are hardly a panacea for complex geopolitical issues.